Well, thank you very much. As all of my colleagues have already mentioned, so many thank yous to the organizers. I would still like to add my own as well. I think it is so important in nowadays circumstances to have this this conference, this webinar, even though it's not as usual in Budapest, but at least we can meet via Teams and share our experiences. And I think this is mostly important, as although we talk mostly about students' motivation today, but this kind of seminar actually keeps our teachers' motivation alive, and this is very, very important. So today, I would also like to share some of the practical issues that I deal with in my classes with students. I'm teaching Chinese in Vilnius University. I've been teaching there for 4 years. And I will split my presentation into 3 parts. I will firstly talk about the reasons why motivation-based language learning is needed in a classroom, and it doesn't really matter if it's virtual or physical classroom. Then I'll mention some of the challenges that I faced with my students, especially in the recent months, and finally talk about the practical ways that I've employed dealing with motivation and lifting students' motivation up. So I'm sure we all know what motivation is, and the scholars have already listed out numbers of various dimensions or various aspects of how to deal with students' motivation, but I think we can all agree that long-term motivation is based on 3 main pillars. It is a motivated teacher, it is a motivated student, and a motivating environment. By environment, I not only mean physical environment, be it a classroom or nowadays a student's bedroom probably, or a kitchen, but it's also some not physical environmental issues, such as students and teachers' psychological environment, for example, students' parents, and so on and so forth. So today, as I mentioned, I'll focus on students' motivation. And every year since I've started teaching in Vilnius University, one of the first things that I do in the first roughly 3 months after the students start studying Chinese, I give them an anonymous survey to fill in because I want to understand more their long-term goals and their long-term motivation. So the main question I ask is why? What is the main reason that the student chose to study Chinese? And this is a summary of the results from the past 4 years. And as you can see, more than a third of the students say that they chose to study sinology and Chinese as part of their studies because they think it will be, in general, useful for their career. Then a quarter of the students say that they simply wanted to challenge themselves. Well, that is very adequate for Generation Z, as we know, because they're they want to be unique, they want to stand out, they want a new challenge, they want to choose something more difficult than their fellow students, and so on. And then the rest, 30%, are already the ones who already have some kind of interest in China, be it Chinese language, Chinese culture, or they have some general interest in East Asian civilizations. So maybe they've previously studied some Japanese, or maybe they're interested in K-pop and so on. So what this diagram shows is that students in the recent decades, I would say, shifted the motivation of students, the long-term motivation shifted from the language itself, the Chinese language being an object of interest, more into the medium to understand culture, history, or politics, and so on. And finally, the majority of students show now that language for them is simply a tool to boost their career opportunities, or as a means to simply challenge themselves. I'm not going to go into detail with this slide. I will just simply mention that this very much links to what Carol Ames, a scholar, has already mentioned in the 90s by the 2 contrasting achievement goal constructs, the mastery goal and the performance goal. So we can still see that the majority of students who answered the question why they chose to study are still related to the mastery goal, which means that their main focus is on learning and gaining the knowledge rather than just performing well. So the next question I ask the students is, since they already have started studying Chinese by that point for a few months, what kind of ways of learning Chinese they find most interesting? And as you can see, of course, the pop culture, Chinese pop culture is the way they find the most interesting. So movies, TV series, music, and so on, as well as communication to their language partner or to the Chinese friends that they find. Textbook exercises, however, they find the most boring. So that means that shows that what they usually do in class, they find, well, less entertaining, and what they can do outside the class is the things that interest them mostly. But paradoxically, being already grown-ups, the students understand that the most effective way to learn Chinese is still those Chinese textbooks which they actually find, as shown before, boring. So then I obviously come to a very difficult question: how to make this process still effective, using the traditional or less traditional methods, but keeping their interest alive, so that they wouldn't think that only the exercises that we do are boring. So the challenges we face, obviously, nowadays, the main challenge is COVID. And this year I've also interviewed, I did an anonymous survey for first year, second years, and third years, and asked them how did COVID, what kind of effect it had on their studies. And on contrast to what in the morning session Dr. Yang Xu pointed out, her results, I think, were quite opposite. Lithuanian students say that the majority of them said that COVID-19 had mostly negative impact on their studies. And only around 10% said that they kind of felt that it has more positive impact than negative impact on it. And additional challenges, I'm not going to go through many of them because a lot of them were already mentioned by previous presenters. I would only like to point out the main one, which I think we all deal with nowadays, is that, as mentioned before, those three pillars that motivation is built on, the environmental pillar is now, the physical environment is completely different for the students. There is no accountability as such, because students are not accountable to the laptop they're sitting in front. They're not accountable to the teacher who is very far away from them physically. And they also don't feel accountable to the students because there's no one sitting on the other side, on either side of themselves. So they don't feel the pressure, the peer pressure either. And the environment usually is not very motivational for learning, as it's usually, as mentioned, their dormitory room or their bedroom or their kitchen. So it's more suitable for leisure activities, for relaxation, and not studying. So I think this is also a very important challenge we face. So finally, and what I would like to focus on most are the ways to make the virtual classes more motivating. And I purposely put this graph from Durney's article from the 90s, which lists out 10 commandments for motivating language learners. I left it purposely very vague, very blurry, because I think those 10 commandments, what he calls 10 commandments, are really very vague. We all know that we all have to present the tasks properly or promote learner autonomy, but how do we make it? So how do we make the number 6 commandment? How do we make the language classes interesting? Because it's easier said than done. So I've listed out a few examples from what I use in my classes nowadays when the classes are done virtually, and I've put them into 3 blocks. The first block, I call it immersion. What I mean by immersion is that I try that my students are involved with as much Chinese and are surrounded with as much Chinese as they can outside of the class. So I ask them to have on their laptops whichever browser they use, so that they have their first homepage website. It cannot be Google, it cannot be Gmail or some other English website. It has to be a Chinese website. So they choose it according to their own interests. It might be some Chinese TV series website, or maybe news in Chinese, and so on. I do it on purpose because this way, the first thing what they see when they open their browser is still some Chinese characters. So they want it or not, they still are faced with Chinese writing. The other method that I think many of you use for the students, especially students of intermediate level or advanced level, is having students' phone settings in Chinese, so that their phone would all be set up in Chinese language and they would be faced with Chinese characters daily and probably minute by minute almost. Another thing that I started adopting since September, I've noticed that when the classes are online, it's even harder for students, especially in their first and second years, to manage their time, because they feel that they have all of the time in their hands. They're all relaxed, sitting on their couch at home, and it's very hard for them to have a plan of actually what they do hour by hour or day by day. So I've asked them to have their daily calendars written in Chinese, so that not only do they manage their time better, but they also practice very useful and very simple, usually, vocabulary in Chinese. So this is on the right-hand side, just an example of one student's Monday list of things, what she does hour by hour. Another thing is communication among classmates in Chinese. We have separate as well group chats, as Jana also mentioned. They use Facebook groups. We use team groups on Microsoft Teams, and all of the communication that happens amongst the students as well as with me, we do it all in Chinese. We do this with currently second-year students, but I think this can also be conducted even with first years. At least some of the sentences that can be understood by them, easier kind of expressions can already be used with even beginners level students. And finally, the feedback that I give to my students when they send in their homework to me, I try to use as much Chinese as I can, so that they would see various expressions or various more kind of technical terms in Chinese as well. Of course, if it's very specific, I don't know, I need to re-explain a student some kind of a grammatical point, I will use a Lithuanian. But if I know that to their level it should be understood in Chinese, then I use Chinese in my feedback as well. The second block of methods I use is what I call simulation. And I think simulation nowadays is especially useful because we don't have a physical environment anymore where I am standing as a lecturer in front of a class and all of the students are sitting in front of me and listening. This kind of environment is gone, so it's easier for students to simulate various situations where they can become lecturers, they can become tour guides, or they can become radio hosts. So, for example, I give students tasks to explain some new words as if they were lecturers, because I give them access to our teacher's book, which is all in Chinese. And as second years, they can already understand some of the explanations. I, of course, don't give them let them prepare very hard explanations on some hard grammar points, but they already try to be lecturers themselves and try to present some new words to other classmates in Chinese. Another interesting thing that we've done previously is the students becoming tour guides. So they need to prepare on one specific tourist attraction here in Vilnius, and they have to present it as if the rest of the class, including myself, as if we were tourists from China or Chinese-speaking tourists. This way they learn much more vocabulary, and another thing is that they don't need to think about the content because they already know the content. The only thing they need to do is to produce it in Chinese, so it's easier for them. Another important thing that I think was very useful, and we've done it previously with the current fourth-year students. Since the university that I've graduated from in China is Zhejiang University, and I did my master's degree in teaching Chinese there, I still know my lecturers, my professors from that university. So I asked all of my students here in Vilnius to write a physical letter, as it was done in the old days, to write a physical letter to a person they still don't know in Chinese. I've put all of their letters in one big envelope, and I've sent it out to my professors in Zhejiang University, who then handed those letters out to their students who are master students of becoming Chinese lecturers, who are going to be teaching Chinese in their soon future. So this is a very win-win situation, because on the one hand side, my students here in Vilnius get to find a Chinese pen friend, a partner who they might later meet when they go to China to study abroad. And at the same time, those future to become Chinese lecturers of Chinese language can see what kind of mistakes my students do, because I purposely do not correct their letters, and they later reply to my students, and my students are very excited to see Chinese handwriting, and sometimes they can't understand the handwritten characters, so I need to help them out, but it's very useful, and the students themselves find it very, very exciting. I'm not going to go into detail about the other ones. And my final block, which is a very horizontal block, I would say, of methods that I use is what I call relatability. And this is mostly related to the material that I give to my students. The textbook that we use is published in China, so it's all given from the very Chinese perspective. It's all about Chinese culture, Chinese various expressions, and so on and so forth. What I try to do when giving them homework outside the textbook, so not the textbook exercises, I try to make it as much relatable to them as I can, so that the content that they produce is related to their daily life. So as you can see, for example, on this picture here, students presenting their traditional Lithuanian dishes made out of potatoes in Chinese, or students listening to a vlog or watching a vlog which is done by a foreigner who lives in China and tells everything in Chinese about his life in Shanghai or whatever other city. This way they feel more connected, and they actually acquire the new vocabulary or grammar points more easily, because the topic itself is not so alien for them. So I try and keep the balance between the Chinese content, the very Chinese culture or China in general related content, and the content that is very much relatable to themselves, them as being students, or them as being foreigners in a foreign country, or them as being Lithuanians. So, for example, for advanced or intermediate level students, I ask them to watch various episodes of such TV shows as 世界青年说, which is foreigners who speak fluent Chinese discussing various aspects of their own cultures and how they interact with the Chinese culture, and so on and so on and so forth. So I hope I made it in time, around 15 minutes. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to discuss more things with you in the discussion if we will still have one. Thank you very much.